So in the year 2023, I took a look back at Return of the Living Dead, my all-time favorite zombie movie, and one of my favorite horror movies overall. Last Halloween, despite having started the video in the summer, I uploaded a look back at Return of the Living Dead Part 2 as part of my Halloween lineup. A movie that I'm not too enthusiastic about. And at the end of that one, I left a cliffhanger for the third and final film in the Return of the Living Dead trilogy. Due to the disappointment of Return of the Living Dead 2, producer Tom Fox realized that his dreams of a long-running franchise based on the hard work of people who weren't him was just not going to happen. Not only did Part 2 not do too well, the 80s was drawing to a close, and with that, horror was not really a major box office draw anymore. As a result of this, he sold the rights to the series to Trimark Pictures, who later assigned director/producer Brian Yuzna to direct and John Penny, who had worked as an editor on the first movie, to write. Brian Yuzna is a very strange horror director. He does a lot of body horror, but it's like fantastical body horror. He worked on movies such as The Re-Animator and Bride of Re-Animator, the latter of which he directed, as well as Society, two of the Silent Night Deadly Night sequels, and The Guyver. Yuzna mostly worked as a producer, but he did foray into directing from time to time, and he was assigned to direct Return of the Living Dead 3. Yuzna himself was a fan of the first movie and had wanted to work on the series for quite some time, and this gave him the opportunity to do that. But I have a minor thing to complain about in regards to this. You had wanted to work on this series, and yet your movie features a lot of deviations from the rules set in the previous movies. Well, we'll get to that when we get to it. Apparently when this movie was given to Yuzna, it was practically carte blanche. The only guideline in which they were given was that the trioxin gas, which raised the dead in the first two movies, had to be what caused the zombies in this movie. This movie really kind of stretches the whole trioxin zombie thing, and besides that, they also deviated from the overall comedic tone of the first two movies. Fans of the first Return of the Living Dead movie sometimes have very harsh opinions on the sequels. I mean, I didn't like the second one very much, and I was pretty hard on it, and I'm not the only one. There are people who think that the second Return of the Living Dead movie is just too silly, it played too much into the comedy aspect of it, and just overall wasn't very good. Well, there are detractors of Return of the Living Dead 3 who believe that the movie wasn't funny enough and just doesn't really feel like a Return of the Living Dead movie.
You kids don't know what you want. That's why you're still kids, 'cause you're stupid. Just tell me what's wrong, what the freaking show!
To some extent, I do agree with this. It does not really feel like a sequel to Return of the Living Dead on the surface. However, I feel I should say I don't hate this movie. I actually do kind of like it. I like it better than the second one for reasons. Although upon a rewatch, I did kind of find a way that this movie does very subtly keep itself in line with its predecessors, specifically the first one, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Early 90s horror is weird. You can definitely see that there was a lot less faith in whatever project because it was mostly done by third-rate studios on less of a budget. It was at this point that studios, big or small, knew that there was not much of a chance of an 80s style horror movie becoming a huge smash hit. It's that weird kind of dead zone period for horror, which was in between the end of the 80s and the release of the first Scream movie. Horror was in a sorry state for this brief period of time. And I feel I should note that while I do like this movie, I don't really think it's like a good movie. It's low budget, it has very little connection to the previous movies, and quite frankly, it spends a lot of time doing nothing. But there's a certain quality to that nothing. I think for what it is, for what it provides, it's a fun watch. Now, they were given the guideline that they had to use trioxin, and for those who didn't pay attention to the movies or didn't watch my previous reviews, 2,4,5-trioxin is a substance that in the lore of the movies the government had recalled. It was intended to be a herbicide, but it ended up raising the dead, so they didn't want that getting around. And in parts 1 and 2, due to human error, there ends up being a zombie outbreak. Whether it's Frank smacking the barrel in the first movie to prove how sturdy it is,
Hey, these things don't leak, do they?
Leak? Hell no. These things were made by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers.
or whether a member of the United States military is smoking a joint and listening to his Walkman while driving, which then causes him to accidentally dump a barrel into a nearby river, which is opened up by a couple of suburban kids. We know what trioxin is. It's the common denominator between all the movies. We know what its origins are, that it was supposed to be used to kill marijuana crops during the Vietnam War, but we don't really know why it's still around. In the first movie, the barrel that causes the outbreak is part of a group of barrels that was sent to the UNITA medical warehouse in error, and we learn that Bert just never corrected the issue and hid them all in the basement. In the second one, we know that the military was transporting some barrels, but for all we know, that was just like routine shit. We never really understood why it was still around. If I had to guess, it's kind of like all those old nerve gas reserves that countries have from the Cold War. There's no real way to dispose of it. They just kind of put it somewhere out of the way and hope that it degrades over time. And in that meantime, the military is just stuck keeping the barrels around. You have to remember, these movies were made during the Cold War, and while nuclear war was a pretty big fear, chemical warfare is always a hot topic. I also want to point out that prior to the development of this movie, Brian Peck, the filthy, disgusting child molester, actually wrote a draft for a prequel movie that would have explored the origins of trioxin. But that didn't end up being used, so what is the move here? Well, first and foremost, I think this movie actually kind of lines up with the first one better than the second one, because it actually does get one thing right, and that is the teenage aspect. Even if the teenagers are played by people in their 20s, it's still a story relating to teenagers, much like the first one. And we're introduced to our main characters, Julie and Kurt. Kurt is played by J. Trevor Edmond, who has a face that's very recognizable, but he was never really in anything big. He had some bit parts in shitty low-budget movies, and in some high-budget movies like Lord of Illusions, and he was in a handful of TV roles. I think the funniest thing about his filmography is the irony that he was in Return of the Living Dead 3 the same year he was in Pumpkinhead 2 Blood Wings. That's funny because Pumpkinhead 2 Blood Wings is another horror sequel that deviates heavily from its predecessor. Julie is played by Melinda Clarke, who at this point was billed as Mindy Clarke. She's a lot more recognizable as she had a decently okay film career, but basically made herself known on television with roles such as Julie Cooper in The OC, as well as Lady Heather in CSI, as well as a handful of guest roles on shows such as Seinfeld, Star Trek Enterprise, and more. Prior to this, Melinda Clarke had starred in about 130 episodes of the soap opera Days of Our Lives, but at the time that this was going on, she had been working on stage and trying to kind of make a name for herself in acting. In the making of documentary, she states that she got this part based on how she was working on a stage production of Sid and Nancy, where she played Nancy, and I'll get to the relevance of that as we go through the movie, but I'm going to go ahead and say early on that Melinda Clarke stands out in her performance the most, and not just because she's smoking hot, like she is fucking hot, but her acting kind of keeps the movie from going into bad territory. She's just like a cut above everyone else in the production. Essentially, this is her movie, everybody else is just acting in it.
I can't do this anymore.
What?
I can't keep pretending. I mean, I want it to be like it was before, but I don't feel the same.
Going back to the trioxin discussion, we get a little bit more lore on it as we find out that at this point in time, the military has been using trioxin as part of some trials for a super soldier program. Kurt and Julie sneak into the base and watch the experiments, and Julie finds herself fascinated by it, which immediately kind of channels Trash from the first movie.
Do you ever fantasize about being killed?
However, in addition to that maybe little reference to the tone of the first movie, there's also just a tiny little bit of dark slapstick that kind of creeps in. As you can probably tell watching this movie by the more dramatic score and the lack of fun, they deviated from the comedic tone as I mentioned, and kind of leaned into a more serious movie with this one. But however, upon rewatching this movie, I kind of get the feeling that people might be over-exaggerating how humorless this movie is, because while the movie does take on an overall more serious tone, they didn't really skimp on the dark humor. It's subtle and it's split up, but the scene that I'm about to talk about here kind of showcases it. So they're running this experiment to control the living dead, and Kurt's father, who is the colonel, has this like freeze dart program. Because as you may know, trioxin zombies can't just be disposed of with a headshot, they're very difficult to get rid of. So the basic premise of this experiment is that they use this dart that freezes the brain, which knocks the zombie out. And this would be great as a concept if the zombies didn't have parts that acted independent of the brain, but whatever. The funny part is that it doesn't really work all that well, and while the guys in the little containment chamber are cleaning up, there's a whole fiasco where one dude gets his fingers bit off and gets attacked. And when they freeze the zombie again and tie him down, the guy who got attacked gets up and attacks another guy. And it basically ruins the Colonel's reputation. While this does kind of go against the rules in the last two movies, where they never actually show a bite causing somebody to turn into a zombie, I can easily just chalk this up to like, oh, they're using like a different batch of trioxin or something to that effect. So after completely embarrassing himself in front of his boss as well as his colleague, played by the chick who played Ursa from Superman 1 and 2, Kurt's dad tells Kurt that they have to move again, and Kurt doesn't want to move because he's got a fine piece of ass in this town, and a fight ensues which causes Kurt and Julie to run away. But tragedy strikes when Julie tries jerking Kurt off on the motorcycle, which is a fucking really bad idea, and Kurt swerves and launches her into a post. And yeah, not to like victim blame or anything, but to the best of my knowledge, you need a lot more focus to drive a motorcycle than you do a car. Like, you can get your dick sucked while driving and probably be okay, but to do that on a motorcycle is just asking for something bad to happen. Fortunately, Kurt remembers, hey, I have my dad's key card and they have this stuff that brings the dead back to life. And of course, you know, you paid for the movie, you know this is gonna happen. From this point on, I feel I should note that Return of the Living Dead 3 was a platform for Brian Yuzna to kind of get his female creature that he didn't really get to use in Bride of Re-Animator. He was apparently very disappointed that the bride creature only appears for like a few minutes, and so he used Return of the Living Dead 3 and the Julie character as a way to make up for this. So while Melinda Clarke's acting steals the show, the character arc and the transformation aids in that, because while it is melodramatic and kind of cheesy at times, this movie does effectively portray a tragic love story. Upon bringing Julie back, we already realized something's wrong, because if you saw the first two movies, you knew this wasn't going to end well, and if this is your first Return of the Living Dead movie, they drop some hints.
What's going on? Kurt, what's wrong with me? Kurt, is that what I'm gonna become?
Julie is freshly dead. She wasn't exposed to it like Freddy and Frank, and she wasn't raised from the grave like the other zombies. Like, she was only really dead from the time of the accident and throughout the whole weekend at Bernie's routine that Kurt does. But even upon waking up, she notices something's off. And there's actually like a really cool zombie in this scene. Now, the zombie designs are kind of similar to how they were in the first one, but a little bit more extravagant. So this guy is basically Return of the Living Dead 3's version of the Tar Man. He's another barrel zombie, and the thing gets pushed over and its skin is all burned and fused to it, so when it tries to free its arm, it like rips half of its skin off. This effect is glorious. Like, Melinda Clarke in an interview said she had no idea that it was going to do that, so like her scream is 100% genuine.
But I didn't know what was going to happen on the day, and this zombie literally like separated its bodies, like split in half right in front of me, and I screamed like it was real.
Not truly grasping the concept of what he's done, Kurt runs off with Julie, and the containment breach leads to the death of an officer and starts a wild goose chase with the army trying to find Kurt and contain Julie. So this movie really does give us the benefit of seeing someone become a zombie without undergoing the whole death thing like in the first movie. Julie is freshly dead, she's starting to get the hunger, but since they have no real prior interaction with the zombies, they don't know how it works. Like right now, Julie's getting the brains craving, but she doesn't really understand it. For as much as this movie deviated from the first two in terms of its tone, it still does get the whole theme of a bad situation escalating and becoming worse and worse due to the character's unwillingness to accept the facts. Bert didn't want to damage his reputation and his business by calling the number on the side of the barrel, and the situation just continued to get worse because he insisted on fixing everything himself. In this one, Kurt doesn't want to lose Julie and attempts to continue running away with her despite the fact that she's become a problem. Even Julie kind of starts to realize this early on during their encounter with the barrel zombie. In an attempt to stop Julie's hunger, the two stop at a convenience store, and I'm surprised I haven't seen this gif more, like Julie eating all the food and spitting it out. Throw a little caption on it, like when your picky eater girlfriend is hungry or some shit. I don't know. So yeah, like we've got the propellant. This is Kurt bringing Julie back. That starts everything down the wrong path. And things only get worse when a routine corner store stop escalates into a conflict with some stereotypical Latin American gangsters.
Don't need all this.
Leave me alone. I don't know what I want.
Well, when are you gonna know?
I don't know when I taste it.
Hey, man. What the fuck is wrong with her?
Which turns into a robbery with the store owner getting shot and Julie biting one of the Vatos. We get to see Julie figure shit out for herself. She bites the gang member on the arm, and while the Return of the Living Dead zombies don't eat flesh, this allows her to figure out that brains are the answer to her hunger. Which this is explained in the first movie, that brains stop the pain of death, like there's a chemical in there, but in this movie they actually kind of offhand mention that the zombies get bioelectricity from the neurons in the brains of the people they kill. I don't know. I'm not like a biologist, so I can't really say if that's bullshit or not, but it's probably bullshit. And everything just keeps kind of piling up and getting worse. Like they're trying to get the injured store owner help, but then he gets his brains blown out by the cops that are chasing them, and to make matters worse, Julie hops in the back and figures out what brains do for the undead, which then causes the store owner to turn into a zombie and attack some cops. And Jesus Christ, that crowbar to the head scene is nasty. This is weird because there's two instances of the zombies in this using tools to kill somebody. Like, the one zombie at the beginning stabs the dude with a scalpel. The store owner zombie cracks a dude's head open with a crowbar. And yeah, even in, like, Night of the Living Dead, they had the scene where the girl stabs her mom with a shovel. And since these zombies are supposed to be intelligent, it's not completely out of line for them to use tools, but I don't know. It's whatever, I don't care. Now, during the middle portion of the movie is where Melinda Clarke really gets to stand out from the rest of the cast as an actress. I had mentioned that she got the part based on her role as Nancy Spungen in a Sid and Nancy stage show, and the story of Julie and Kurt is one that mirrors addiction, much like the story of Sid and Nancy. Julie's undying hunger for brains is very reminiscent of dealing with an addict, and Kurt, who isn't a zombie and therefore isn't an addict, has to try and handle it but can't truly grasp the problem himself. After she eats the store owner, the two start fighting, and Kurt lashes out at her.
You brought me back. You should have just left me dead.
Is that what you want? Do you want to be dead? All right, that's fine. What was I thinking? Look at you. You're disgusting.
Basically scolding her for something that is essentially his fault, which causes Julie to attempt suicide by jumping off of a bridge, which of course doesn't kill her, but it's still a pretty sad scene. It's a bit melodramatic, but it is somewhat relatable. Like, I've never had a girl jump off a bridge or anything, but when you're young and your emotions are going, you're not quite mature yet like these two characters are, shit can get kind of melodramatic. The chemistry between J. Trevor Edmond and Melinda Clarke is pretty solid. You definitely get the feeling that this is a young, naive couple, even though they're both like 25. Kurt was guilty and wanted his goth girlfriend back, and he got her back, but now he has to deal with her being a brain-hungry monster who kills everything around them and makes shit worse and worse. He got way more than he bargained for. While Kurt is kind of a dick, you do feel bad for him. Like, he thought he was doing the right thing by bringing Julie back, but was he doing it for her, or was he doing it for himself? And it definitely leans more into he was doing it for himself when you look at what happens to people who are brought back with trioxin. Granted, there was no way for Kurt to actually know this would happen, but still, he saw some of the experiment, he just didn't really take much of it in, and he didn't see the worst part of it. This in turn makes you feel even worse for Julie, who at this point has a craving for brains so strong that the only thing that can stave it off is excessive self-harm, which I feel I should note can be a trait among those who are mentally ill or have substance abuse problems. And this is far from the first story to have somebody resurrect a loved one and have it be more than they bargained for, but I think using the whole addiction allegory and having it be a teenage couple just makes it very effective as a horror tragedy. The story story between Kurt and Julie and the chemistry between the actors is way better than it has any right being for this kind of movie. And it's honestly kind of a shame that this movie didn't get the type of budget or support that the last two movies had, because I think being the 90s, this movie could have resonated with a wider audience based on this premise alone. Like, the story itself is just sad. Like, you look at it and it's like you feel sorry for everybody involved. It manages to take this very unrealistic situation and make it kind of relatable. Like, I understand the part where Kurt lashes out at Julie, because, you know, when you're close to someone who has problems, you might lash out at them and then feel really bad about it later. I genuinely felt sad for both of these characters. Some of the complaints I've heard about Return of the Living Dead 3 from people who prefer the second one or just don't like any of the sequels is that this movie is slow. And yes, it's slow, and if you're not really in the mood for it, it could be boring, and yeah, it's not as exciting as the first one or even the second one, but what we have here is a focused character-based movie. We're following a story of young love and tragedy with Kurt and Julie. We're getting a complete play-by-play of what Freddy and Frank or Joey and Ed went through with the transformation, except the difference is this is slowly somebody grasping and realizing what they've become, whereas in Return of the Living Dead 1, Frank and Freddy just kinda instantly transformed in the back half of the movie. Nevertheless, there are two highlights of this movie, and the turmoil between Kurt and Julie is one of those highlights. Julie being freshly dead means it takes a little bit of time for her to lose her humanity, but it's tragic watching her struggle to hang on to it while Kurt can do nothing about it. The movie itself kind of feels like it's structured based on the stages of grief, and Julie's transformation from hot goth girlfriend into brain-eating monster is slow and tragic. Following Julie's suicide attempt on the bridge, the two meet a vagrant known as Riverman, who lives in the sewer system, and he tries to help the two out. To pad it out, we have some scenes of the military trying to contain the situation as a B-plot, and we get some bickering between Kurt's dad and Ursa, and then partway through this whole middle part of the movie, you got the Vatos trying to find Kurt and Julie because the guy she bit is getting all sick and dying.
Who bit you?
Bitch in the store.
She gave you something, Nessie. She gave you something bad.
Well, what is it, man?
I don't know. Gangrene. Rabies, man. Maybe the bitch had rabies.
And all that stuff is fine, it serves its purpose, but it's just padding for the Kurt and Julie stuff. And at times, yeah, I do feel bad for Kurt, but at other times he's just a dick. Like, he's just treating her kind of like shit, not really understanding what she's going through, and Julie, wanting to make things work, is trying her best to act normal and using the self-harm to stave off the pain of being dead, which she then goes hog wild on while the Vatos beat up Kurt and Riverman. And then we get to our second highlight of the movie, which is when Julie emerges after completely mutilating herself, and yeah, I think seeing this as a teenager completely fucked me up in a good and bad way. Julie comes out as like this complete punk rock zombie monster, and the makeup job is really good. Like, some of the special effects in this are hit or miss. This is fucking phenomenal, and it's a shame that I can't show all of it because Melinda Clarke has her fucking titties out, but this design is glorious. It's just so visceral, and yet it is so fucking attractive. I'm a fucking sick man. I'd have sex with that thing. I don't care. And, you know, if Melinda Clarke does happen to see this, I do apologize for my crass remarks, but you were really hot in this movie. I want to take a quick second here to talk about the Santos character. I was like, this guy looks familiar. Like, he looks like a Latin American Stacy Keach. But I did a little bit of digging, and by digging I mean I looked at the IMDb page and found out he was played by character actor Mike Moroff, who was the guy that robbed the convenience store in RoboCop. He's pretty funny in this movie. Like, he makes that comment about Julie in the store, and it's like, it's weird because he's kind of out of place with this group. You'd think like a younger guy would be there, because like they're all kind of probably teenage, early 20s age, like gangster types, but this dude's like an old school Vato. And then he fucks around and finds out when he tries to bang Julie and gets his head ripped off.
Don't you ever feed her, Issy?
So after Julie emerges as a monster and completely gives into her zombie instincts, the whole story goes to shit because she wastes all the Vatos in a pretty brutal fashion, I might add, but me and who. But because of this, we get a little bit more of that escalating problem issue because all the Vatos that Julie killed are now back as zombies. And furthermore, Julie is starting to fall more and more into just being an uncontrollable zombie. The pain isn't stopping her from getting hungry anymore, and finally she gives into her hunger and kills Riverman while Kurt tries to hold off the zombies. And yeah, Mindy Clark really kind of put her all into the zombie performance as well. She's like creepy, but she's still kind of hot. This is almost like the actual climax of the movie before the climax. This is like what you would watch this movie for, to see punk rock zombie Julie fucking kill everybody. And it's kind of a shame that we don't get this Julie design for very long because the military saves the day and captures all of the zombies, and Julie gets all the stuff pulled out of her for the actual climax. Early on, we get hints from that character played by the woman who played Ursa that they're using the zombies for a kind of exosuit experiment. And so at the end, when Kurt's dad is getting debriefed or whatever, Kurt goes and sees that they are experimenting on all the zombies, including Julie. Kurt still tries to break Julie out because he feels bad that she's just gonna be like experimented on and ripped apart and whatnot. And this causes a complete shit show at the military base. So basically Riverman gets fitted with an exosuit and then he starts kind of going berserk because I guess he really wasn't down for that. The zombies start breaking out, and the only reason Kurt gets out of this is because Riverman has some of his humanity left when Kurt shows him the coin that he gave him earlier, and he uses his exosuit to rip the door open. But going into this, you had to know it wouldn't have been a happy ending for a movie, because Kurt gets bit, and then him and Julie decide it's better to burn out than to fade away. Nah, they both just decide to jump into an industrial furnace, and it's kind of sad, but also kind of funny at the same time. The movie does abruptly end, and I think if they had more of a budget, they could have done more with it, but it does its job. It tells a tragic love story that ends like Romeo and Juliet. Except Juliet eats a bunch of people, and then Romeo and Juliet jump into a furnace. Now, I feel I should level with you guys a little bit. I said seeing this movie when I was like 15, 16 kind of screwed me up because of the Julie zombie. I haven't been entirely truthful with you because the fact is I didn't actually see this movie in full until maybe 5 or 6 years ago. See, the thing is, Return of the Living Dead 1, really easy to find on DVD. Return of the Living Dead 2, extremely easy to find on DVD. Even easier than the first one because Return of the Living Dead 2 was like a bargain bin movie. I could not for the life of me find the third movie on DVD back in the day, and for some reason or another I just never watched it through other means. I was only aware of it because of some clips on YouTube and like videos people had made about it, and it was all stuff that centered around the Julie zombie, and I fell in love with the concept. When I finally did get around to watching it, I'd say my reaction was a little bit mixed, but I do appreciate this movie. I appreciate the positives, but I'm not going to ignore the negatives. The positives are the good performance of Melinda Clark, the chemistry between her and J. Trevor Edmund, and the general idea behind it. Like, it does continue the whole trend of the Return of the Living Dead movies. It has trioxin in it, it's got the escalating conflict, and I'll get more into this as we go through the wrap-up here, but this movie doesn't completely isolate itself from its predecessors. However, this movie is full of negatives. It's shot on, like, video, I think. It does not look like a film. It looks a lot cheaper than the first two, and that's fine. This was like a straight-to-video movie. And the problem is, whenever we actually do get to the zombies, we don't really see a lot of them, and in the climax, when there's all the zombies around, it's all really low lit. You never really get a good look at anything, and I don't understand why. Because the special effects in this movie are actually pretty good. Like, the suits they made for the barrel zombies look good. Sure, the Santos headless zombie's a little bit corny, but like, everything looks good in this movie. I don't know why the lighting was so bad. It just simply didn't show enough, and I can understand why some people might not be so into this movie. It is definitely flawed, but I personally liked it. But as tragic and sad as this movie is, I think it's even sadder that the idea behind Return of the Living Dead had so much potential as a loose anthology, and yet this is where it ended. But I guess much like the love between Kurt and Julie, it was never meant to last forever. I like this movie for what it is, and a lot of people would say if it wasn't titled Return of the Living Dead, it would have made more sense, but honestly, thematically, even though it's not much of a comedy, it does fit. I mentioned that Julie as a character is similar to Trash, and that the story of the military and its use of trioxin is continued. Like, sure, the zombies do some shit that they couldn't do before, and it does kind of go off the rails with the exosuit shit, but it's not completely unfitting. If anything, it is a semi-logical evolution of the concept. I think one thing that I actually can't forgive in terms of relation to its predecessors is the fact that this movie doesn't really have that good of a score. Like, it's not terrible, it fits. It's definitely more dramatic, which fits the tragic love story tone, but it sounds like really cheap MIDI shit. Which also brings me to the fact that there is no licensed soundtrack in this movie, something the first two movies had in droves. It's like one of the only noteworthy things about the second movie is the licensed soundtrack. However, this does kind of fall in line for what Tom Fox had originally intended with part 2, and that is to make a more serious horror movie out of it. So I guess you get rid of some, you get some, I don't know how the term goes. I don't think the movie is scary, but the zombie and gore effects are really solid, and the story itself kinda does make you feel sad. It kinda just brings up memories of you being young, maybe in your first or second serious relationship, and learning that it probably wasn't gonna work, but trying to force it to anyway and just making everything worse. Except instead of mental health problems, or drug problems, or even personal differences, it's just someone becoming an undead brain-eating monster. And it actually does kind of capture 90s teenage angst, just a little bit. Return of the Living Dead 1 was clearly very punk rock inspired, and Return of the Living Dead 2 didn't really have that going for it. It did have like a hair metal type soundtrack, and in a sense, the more kind of family friendly thing they were going for with like the kid adventure stuff, you could easily relate to the over commercialization of entertainment in the late 80s, which hair metal is a great part of. But anyway, the point I'm trying to get to is Return of the Living Dead 3, having come out in 1993, is very grunge inspired. You see that group of teenagers at the beginning, which don't appear in the movie again, you'd think they would, but Kurt and Julie are just very much into the whole grunge thing, both style-wise and character-wise, because one of the things they talk about when they're running away from Kurt's dad is running away to Seattle, and Kurt is actually a drummer. So once again, it very subtly connects itself to a theme from the first one, just kind of modernized. When the movie does decide to go all out for its highlight scenes, that being the opening lab scene, Julie killing the Vato scene, and the climax, it's not bad. It's certainly low-budget 90s horror, but it does a good job of being low-budget 90s horror. And it manages to add an interesting dash to the overall lore of the trioxin zombies. Sure, it's flawed, it's slow, you might have to be in the mood for it, but I do find this movie to be enjoyable. Return of the Living Dead 3, as I mentioned previously, was not a widely theatrically released film. It only had a very limited theatrical release in the United States before going straight to home video. So its box office was only $50,000 versus its $2 million budget, but I am sure in rentals it made its money back. Just like, look at the cover, that's something you would rent. And sure, it didn't really do any good for anybody involved because the state of horror was dead, but it is worth noting that despite having become a legitimate television actress, Melinda Clarke has very fond memories of the movie and looks at it in a positive light. Most actors who did like a horror thing before they got into more serious acting tend to kind of shit on the horror thing, but Melinda Clarke appears at conventions, she talks about fans of the movie, and she did interviews for the documentary feature on the Blu-ray, and was even featured in one of the commentary tracks. So it's nice to know that while Melinda Clarke is a successful television actress, she didn't forget where she came from and has accepted her place among horror fans as the hot zombie chick from Return of the Living Dead 3. Nevertheless, this was the final installment of the Return of the Living Dead series. I would say as far as 80s horror franchises go that that aren't Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, it did pretty well. It has one movie that's looked upon very fondly with two sequels that have cult followings. I really don't think it needed to end this way because the premise is so malleable and yet unique that you could come up with 100 stories for it and it would probably do somewhat well. Hell, all this very low-budget horror movie needed was a hot, mutilated zombie chick, and people still talk about it from time to time. You see people cosplaying this on, like, Instagram and shit from time to time. It's, in a way, as memorable as the first and second ones, and holds up pretty well, at least in terms of recognizability. Like, you'd bring up Return of the Living Dead 3, and somebody who's, like, part of the horror community, even on a casual basis, would be like, oh, that's the one with the hot zombie chick, right? And so, yeah, despite being unremarkable and not really lighting a fire under the ass of the franchise, it will always be known as the movie with the hot zombie chick. Well, that was my final installment in the look back at the Return of the Living Dead trilogy series. I like 1 and 3 a lot, and 2 has its moments that I like, but I think if you're a fan of these movies, you either like the second one and hate the third one, or you hate the second one and like the third one. I guess I'm team Return of the Living Dead 3, but regardless of personal taste, I had a lot of fun talking about this trilogy, and really hope that someday they do something else with it. Maybe with, like, some of the original cast. I think Miguel Nunez still acts. So what are your thoughts on Return of the Living Dead 3? Let me know in the comments, and... okay, fuck, fine. As much as I would have liked it to be, Return of the Living Dead 3 was not the final installment in the Return of the Living Dead series. I think if it was, the series itself would have had a much better reputation, but much like everything I like, there's always gotta be this fucking blemish. And in the case of this series, there's 2 of them. So while Tom Fox was actually credited as a producer on Return of the Living Dead 3, it's fairly obvious he had little involvement in it as he sold the rights to Trimark. However, when the rights reverted back to Tom Fox, he went to Sci-Fi, who shot 2 made-for-TV sequels titled Return of the Living Dead 4 Necropolis and Return of the Living Dead 5 Rave to the Grave. And trust me, these are about as in-name only as sequels can get. There was nothing of note in these sequels except the 4th one kind of carries on the super soldier thing from 3, and the 5th one has a very shitty Tarman cameo in it. The zombies in these movies are killable, and the movies are so bad and low budget, like, I never watched them, I don't plan on watching them. I've seen bits and pieces, and that's really all I need to see. The best way I can sum it up is with this clip of Flanders.
Well, I've seen about enough.
Okay, I guess there's one other noteworthy thing, something I just found out while doing like 5 minutes of research on these sequels, is that both of these movies were written by horror actor Bill Butler, who you may remember from Friday the 13th Part 7, Texas Chainsaw Massacre 3, and the Night of the Living Dead remake. With the first 3 Return of the Living Dead movies, there's some memories attached to them. Like, I remember going to HMV to buy Return of the Living Dead on DVD and then really liking it. But even prior to that, there's the memory of me seeing it on a movie channel and not knowing what the movie was. With 2, there's the memory of just randomly seeing it on the movie network as well, and then there's the memory of me being disappointed by it, but still finding something like the Michael Jackson zombie funny. And then with 3, there's the memory of fucking pubescent Otto wanting to just, like, go to town on the hot zombie girl. But I don't have any memories of 4 and 5 because I never watched them and I don't plan on watching them. I guess the only thing even close to a memory I have of Return of the Living Dead 4 and 5 is my friend Brad had them on DVD for some reason. Like, he got them at the bargain bin at HMV because you could get those movies for like 2 for $3 or whatever. And I remember, like, joking about watching them. Like, if we were sitting there, he'd be like, oh, I'm gonna put it on. I'd be like, oh god, don't put it on. And then he never ended up putting it on. But I guess there's like a running joke attached to how bad these 2 movies are. So yeah, that's my memory of 4 and 5, is just like not wanting to watch them because they were bad. As you would have guessed, the series didn't really get reignited following the 2 bad sequels. What a fucking surprise. And despite being a concept that I still to this day think could be utilized for movies, it just hasn't really come up. That's what I would be saying if this past holiday season they didn't didn't just announce a sequel. From what it appears, based on press releases and whatnot, this is to be a direct sequel set 18 months after the original, and it appears that it takes place during Christmas for some reason. I don't know how optimistic I can be about this. I don't really have high hopes for it. I don't think a sequel would need to be tied to the first one because 2 and 3 were just different stories with the trioxin gas, and while I don't like 2 that much, it worked as a concept, and 3 worked as well. Return of the Living Dead is a tough act to follow, and I think they did about as good of a job as they could have doing it. And that's because both sequels were done by accomplished horror directors. The guy they have attached to this sequel just did like 3 made-for-streaming horror movies, and those are always garbage. And with that, I can now kind of put Return of the Living Dead behind me, at least until the sequel comes out. You can easily ignore 4 and 5 and just look at the series ending with a tragic love story. So once again, thoughts on the movie in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Oh, and happy Valentine's Day.